My name is Stella Marchetti. I am 27 years old, and I am the chef and founder of Amber and Vine, a small farm-to-table restaurant on the waterfront that I built from nothing but my aunt's inheritance and my own 2 hands, red hair always pulled back in a knot by 6 in the morning, because a kitchen has no patience for vanity. I was standing in that kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, flour on my forearms, when my accountant called and asked a question that stopped me completely where I stood. "Stella, why does the state filing list you as a 15% shareholder?" I laughed. Actually laughed, because it had to be a clerical error, because I had built this restaurant with my hands and my aunt's money, and 3 years of 18-hour days. Because Vanessa was my best friend since college, my partner, the one who handled the business side so I could stay in the kitchen where I belonged. "Check again," I said. "There's a mistake somewhere." There was no mistake. Vanessa Cole owned 80% of Amber and Vine. My own brother Derek owned the remaining 5%. I owned 15% of a restaurant that existed because I had emptied every account I had, because I had signed away 3 years of my life to build it, because I had trusted the people I loved most in this world with paperwork I never once thought to read closely. I hung up the phone and stood very still in my own kitchen, staring at the stainless steel counter I had scrubbed 1,000 times with my own hands, understanding for the first time that the restaurant I believed was mine had never legally belonged to me at all. Vanessa walked in 20 minutes later, cheerful, carrying 2 coffees like she always did, completely unaware that I already knew. I had questions. I had no answers yet. What had she actually signed me into 3 years ago, when I trusted her enough not to read the fine print? Why was my own brother, a man who had never once worked a single shift in this restaurant, listed as a shareholder at all? And most of all, how long had they been planning this, waiting patiently for the restaurant to succeed before quietly closing the door on the woman who built it? Vanessa smiled at me over the rim of her coffee cup, and I smiled back, because I had learned a great deal about smiling through pain over the last 3 years of building something I now understood I might already have lost. I had no idea yet how deep it went, or how far my own brother was willing to go to take it from me. I met Vanessa Cole in my 2nd year of culinary school in Portland. Both of us broke, both of us hungry in every sense of the word, sharing a cramped apartment above a laundromat where the dryers ran until midnight, and the whole building smelled permanently of fabric softener. She studied business while I studied food, and somewhere in those late nights of instant noodles and shared ambition, we made each other a promise the way only 20-year-olds can, certain and reckless and completely sincere. One day we would open a restaurant together. She would run the numbers. I would run the kitchen. I never forgot that promise. Even after graduation scattered us to different cities for a few years, me working under a demanding French chef in Seattle who taught me more about discipline than kindness, Vanessa climbing through a series of marketing jobs in Chicago that paid well but left her, by her own admission, hollow in a way money never quite filled. My Aunt Rosalind changed everything the year I turned 24. She had never married, had built a small but comfortable fortune trading antiques out of a shop in Savannah, and when the cancer finally took her after a short, brutal fight, she left me $210,000, along with a note that read simply, "Build something that outlasts you." I called Vanessa the same week the money cleared. She was on a plane to Portland within 4 days, and by the end of that month, we had signed a lease on a narrow waterfront space that had been sitting empty for 11 months. The kind of place a realtor calls a diamond in the rough, and everyone else calls a money pit. We named it Amber and Vine, after the amber light that poured through the west windows every evening at sunset, and the small vineyard my aunt used to tend behind her Savannah shop. I designed the menu. I sourced every supplier myself, driving 2 hours some mornings to a farm outside the city, because their heirloom tomatoes tasted like something worth building a restaurant around. Vanessa handled what she called the boring part, the incorporation paperwork, the business licenses, the lease negotiations, all of it filed under her laptop, while I stood over a stove testing sauces until 2 in the morning. I trusted her completely. The The way you trust someone who shared instant noodles with you at 20 years old and swore they would never let you down. When she pushed a stack of documents across our tiny shared office table one exhausted evening in our first month, telling me it was standard formation paperwork, ownership split evenly the way we'd always planned. I signed every page without reading past the first paragraph, because reading closely felt, at the time, like an insult to a friendship I believed was unbreakable. That signature would follow me for 3 years before I understood what it had actually said. My brother Derek entered the picture more gradually, the way water finds its way into a foundation crack, patient and quiet until the damage becomes structural. Derek was 2 years older than me, the golden child growing up, the one our parents pointed to at every family dinner, while I stood in the kitchen actually cooking the meal nobody thanked me for. He had bounced between failed business ventures for most of his 20s, a food truck that lasted 6 months, a cryptocurrency scheme that cost our parents $12,000 they never fully discussed, a marketing consultancy that consisted mostly of expensive dinners with potential clients who never became actual clients. When Amber and Vine opened, Derek showed up to the launch party in a blazer that cost more than our first month's grocery budget, shook hands with our early investors, and told anyone who would listen that he had always believed in his little sister's talent, as though he had contributed anything beyond his presence and his charm. I didn't think much of it at the time. Family shows up to openings. That's simply what family does. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't understand for years, was that Derek and Vanessa had started having dinner together without me almost immediately after that opening night. Quiet conversations at restaurants across town, where nobody from our world would recognize them together. I found this out much later, but by then the damage those dinners caused had already been baked into documents I had signed with my own hand. The restaurant struggled through its first year the way every new restaurant struggles: thin margins, unreliable suppliers, a review in the local paper that called our concept promising but unrefined, a phrase that kept me awake for a week straight. I worked harder. I redesigned the menu twice. I let go of a line cook who couldn't keep pace with dinner service and took his station myself for 2 months until I found someone better. Vanessa, meanwhile, spent that same difficult year meeting with our accountant, our lawyer, and apparently, though I didn't know it, with Derek, laying groundwork I couldn't see because I was too busy keeping the actual restaurant alive to notice what was happening around it. By our second year, Amber and Vine had turned a real corner. A prominent food blogger discovered us almost by accident, wrote a glowing piece about our seasonal tasting menu, and within 3 months, we had a wait list most weekends and a second location already under discussion. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt exhausted in a way success never quite explained, the particular exhaustion of someone who senses something is wrong long before she can name what it is. Small things nagged at me that second year, easy enough to dismiss individually, difficult to ignore once I started noticing the pattern. Vanessa began handling all correspondence with our landlord personally, cutting me out of email threads I used to be copied on. She started attending investor meetings alone, telling me my time was better spent in the kitchen, which sounded reasonable enough until I realized I hadn't seen a single financial statement in nearly 8 months. When I asked for updated numbers, she'd promise to send them and then somehow never quite follow through. Always something more urgent demanding her attention first. Derek's presence around the restaurant grew steadily that year too, showing up for what he called casual visits that always seemed to coincide with Vanessa's schedule, the two of them disappearing into the back office for conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I walked in. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself Vanessa was simply keeping my brother updated out of politeness, the way you might update any family member curious about a sibling's success. I told myself a great many things that year that I no longer believe. The first real crack appeared during our 3rd year, when a supplier I had personally recruited, a small organic dairy farm 2 hours north, called to ask why their invoices were being paid nearly 90 days late despite our restaurant's growing revenue. I brought this to Vanessa immediately, expecting concern, expecting the same urgency I felt about protecting relationships I had built with my own hands. Cash flow is complicated right now, she told me, barely looking up from her laptop. I'm handling it. You don't need to worry about the money side, Stella. That's literally why we split the roles the way we did. I remember that sentence specifically because something about the way she said it, the faint edge of dismissal underneath the reassurance, sat wrong in my stomach for days afterward without my fully understanding why. Around the same time, Derek started making comments at family dinners that felt, in retrospect, like careful reconnaissance disguised as brotherly pride. He'd ask detailed questions about the restaurant's valuation, about expansion plans, about whether I had considered bringing on additional investors to accelerate growth. I answered honestly, the way you answer a brother you still believed loved you, never once suspecting he was gathering information for anything other than genuine interest in my success. My mother mentioned once, almost in passing, that Derek had been spending a lot of time with Vanessa lately, working on some side project together. I asked what kind of project. My mother shrugged and said something vague about marketing consulting, the same phrase Derek had used for years to describe ventures that never quite materialized into anything real. I didn't think to ask Vanessa about it directly. That, more than anything else, is the mistake I still find hardest to forgive myself for. Not the trust itself, but the specific blindness of loving someone so completely that you stop asking the questions that might save you. By the end of that third year, Amber and Vine had become genuinely successful, profitable in a way few independent restaurants manage within their first 3 years. Featured in a regional magazine's list of destinations worth traveling for, I should have been celebrating. Instead, I lay awake most nights with a low, persistent unease I couldn't quite justify with anything concrete. The specific instinct of a woman who has built something valuable enough that other people might finally want to take it from her. That unease turned out to be the only honest thing in my life that entire year. The accountant's call about the shareholder filing arrived 2 weeks after that magazine feature ran. And once I finally understood what I was looking at, once I finally sat down with a lawyer of my own instead of the one Vanessa had always insisted on us sharing, the full shape of what had happened over 3 years finally came into focus. And it was worse, considerably worse, than a single suspicious signature. The lawyer I hired, a sharp woman named Priya Anand who specialized in small business disputes, spent 4 days going through every document Vanessa had ever asked me to sign, and called me into her office on a Friday afternoon with an expression that told me before she said a single word that whatever she'd found, it wasn't going to be simple. "The formation documents you signed 3 years ago," Priya said, sliding a folder across her desk, "list an 85% ownership split in Vanessa's favor, not the 50-50 arrangement you believed you signed. There's language buried in a secondary clause about capital contribution ratios that technically justifies it, based on some calculation involving startup costs Vanessa apparently claims she personally covered." "She didn't cover anything," I said. "My aunt's money paid for every piece of that restaurant, every table, every stove, every dollar of the lease deposit." Priya nodded slowly. "That's what I suspected." "Do you have documentation showing the inheritance funds moving directly from your account into the business?" I did, because I had kept every bank statement from that period out of the same instinctive caution that made me keep receipts for everything, a habit my aunt had drilled into me from childhood. Priya photographed each one, building what she called a paper trail, though she warned me that the original signed documents would still carry significant legal weight regardless of where the money had actually originated. "There's something else," Priya said, and something in her tone made my stomach drop before she even continued. "Your brother's 5% stake. It wasn't part of the original formation. It was added 14 months ago through an amendment you also signed." I remembered that amendment now, vaguely, a stack of papers Vanessa had handed me during an exceptionally chaotic week when we were dealing with a health inspection and a broken walk-in freezer simultaneously, telling me it was routine paperwork related to updating our insurance coverage. I had signed it in the kitchen, standing up, barely reading past the first line, exactly the way I had signed everything else, because by then trusting Vanessa without question had become as automatic as breathing. "Why would she add Derek?" I asked. though some part of me already suspected an answer I wasn't ready to hear yet. Priya pulled out a second folder, this one considerably thinner, containing records she'd obtained through a business researcher she occasionally worked with, someone who specialized in tracing corporate relationships that weren't immediately visible on paper. "Your brother and Vanessa formed a separate LLC together 9 months ago," she said. "Cole Marchetti Hospitality Group. It's currently inactive, no assets, no filings beyond the initial registration. But its stated purpose in the formation documents is, and I'm reading this directly, acquisition and management of restaurant properties and associated intellectual property." I stared at that phrase for a long time. Acquisition and management, intellectual property, my menus, my recipes, the specific slow reduction technique I'd spent 2 years perfecting for our signature dish, all of it suddenly sounding like assets on a spreadsheet rather than the work of my own hands. "They're planning to push you out," Priya said gently, but without softening the truth. "I can't say with certainty what the exact mechanism will be yet. A forced buyout using their majority stake, a vote to remove you from any operational authority, possibly even termination of your employment at a restaurant you built, using the majority ownership to justify it. But the pattern here is deliberate, Stella. This isn't an accident of bad paperwork. Someone planned this carefully, over more than a year, and your brother has been part of that planning from very early on." I left Priya's office that afternoon and sat in my car in the parking lot for nearly 40 minutes, unable to make myself start the engine, replaying 3 years of friendship and family loyalty through a lens that made every warm memory suddenly look calculated. Every late-night conversation with Vanessa about our shared dream suddenly sound like a woman quietly building her exit strategy from someone else's labor. I thought about the two of us at 20 years old, sharing instant noodles above that laundromat, promising each other we'd build something real together. I wondered how much of that promise had ever been genuine, and how much had simply been patient groundwork for exactly this moment, 3 years and 1 successful restaurant later. I didn't confront Vanessa immediately. I understood, sitting in that parking lot, that confrontation without leverage would accomplish nothing except warning her that I already knew, giving her and Derek time to tighten whatever plan they'd been quietly building for over a year. Instead, I did something Priya suggested carefully, almost hesitantly, as though she wasn't entirely certain I'd be willing to consider it. She mentioned a man she'd worked with on 2 previous business disputes, someone who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. Minority partners who'd been quietly diluted or maneuvered out of businesses they'd actually built. His name was Nathaniel Cross, and Priya described him simply as someone who understood how to fight leverage with leverage, rather than simply filing a lawsuit and hoping a judge eventually sorted out the mess. "He's not cheap," Priya warned me, "but in situations like yours, sometimes the courtroom isn't actually where the real battle gets won." I met Nathaniel Cross for the first time on a rainy Tuesday morning in a small office 3 floors above a bookshop. Nothing like the glass towers I'd expected from Priya's description. He was tall, dark-haired, somewhere in his early 30s, dressed simply in a charcoal sweater rather than the expensive suit I'd anticipated. And he listened to my entire story without interrupting once. The same careful patience Priya had shown weeks earlier. "Your friend and your brother made one significant mistake," he said once I'd finished. "They assumed you'd either never find out, or that once you did, you'd panic and either fight publicly, which would damage the restaurant's reputation and value, or simply walk away entirely, which is clearly what they're hoping for. Both of those responses would work in their favor. What they haven't planned for is someone who understands leverage the way you're about to." "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. "It means the restaurant's success is actually the thing protecting you right now. A profitable, well-reviewed restaurant is worth considerably more to outside investors than an internal ownership dispute is worth fighting over in court for 2 years. If the right investor approached them with an offer to buy a portion of the business, an offer generous enough to make walking away from the fight look far more appealing than continuing it, they might sell without ever suspecting who was actually behind the offer." I understood immediately what he was suggesting, and felt something between fear and reckless hope settle into my chest at once. You want to be that investor. I want you to have every legal advantage available to you before this becomes public, Nathaniel said. If they believe they're selling to an anonymous outside buyer eager to invest in a successful restaurant, they'll likely negotiate from a position of confidence rather than fear, which typically means they'll agree to terms far more favorable to whoever's actually buying than they would if they understood the true stakes. And if it works, if they sell, then depending on how we structure the acquisition and depending on what percentage we're able to negotiate them down to, you could end up in a considerably stronger ownership position than the 15% they currently believe defines your entire stake in something you built with your own hands. I sat with that possibility for a long moment, watching rain slide down the window behind him, understanding that what he was proposing carried real risk, that if Vanessa or Derek ever discovered the connection before the deal closed, the entire plan would collapse and likely expose me to exactly the retaliation I was trying to avoid. "Why would you take this case?" I asked him honestly. "This sounds like considerably more effort than a standard legal dispute." Something shifted briefly behind his expression, quick enough that I almost missed it. "Because I've watched this exact pattern happen to too many people who built something real with their own hands, only to have it quietly taken by people who contributed considerably less than they claimed to. I don't love watching that happen. I especially don't love watching it happen to someone who clearly still loves the work itself, underneath everything else you're currently feeling." I didn't fully understand yet how much that sentence would come to matter to me later. At the time, I simply nodded and told him I wanted to move forward. We spent the following 6 weeks building the plan, carefully, methodically, the way Priya had built her legal case, and the way Nathaniel now built his financial approach. He created a holding entity, Cross Harbor Capital, with no visible connection to me or to Priya's firm, designed to look exactly like the kind of boutique investment group that occasionally acquired stakes in promising independent restaurants looking to expand. Nathaniel reached out to Vanessa directly through an intermediary broker, someone he'd worked with before who had no idea of the real story underneath the transaction, framing the approach as unsolicited interest based on the restaurant's recent magazine feature and its strong regional reputation. The offer, when it finally reached Vanessa's inbox, proposed acquiring 60% of Amber and Vine's total ownership at a valuation considerably higher than what she could reasonably expect from continuing to run an increasingly complicated internal dispute with a co-founder who might eventually lawyer up in ways that damage the restaurant's public reputation. I watched Vanessa's behavior shift almost immediately once that offer landed. The particular energy of someone who believes she's finally found an elegant exit from a problem she'd been quietly managing for over a year. She started coming into the kitchen more often, complimenting dishes she hadn't bothered tasting in months, asking about my long-term vision for the restaurant in a tone that sounded almost sentimental, the tone of someone preparing to leave something behind rather than someone planning to seize full control of it. Derek called me twice that month, something he rarely did, asking casual questions about the restaurant's growth trajectory that I now recognized immediately as due diligence for a sale he clearly believed was already moving forward in his favor. I answered carefully, honestly, giving him nothing that would raise suspicion, while inside I felt something cold and steady settling over the fear I'd carried since that first phone call from my accountant. The negotiations moved faster than even Nathaniel had initially expected, largely because Vanessa, eager to close the deal before I could discover anything about the ownership structure, pushed for an accelerated timeline, insisting to the broker that speed mattered more than extended due diligence. Derek, for his part, seemed almost giddy at family dinners those weeks, dropping vague hints about an exciting opportunity on the horizon that would, in his words, finally give him the kind of financial stability he'd been chasing his entire adult life. I sat through those dinners smiling, the way I'd learned to smile through 3 years of quiet betrayal, watching my brother celebrate a windfall built entirely on taking something away from me, understanding that within weeks, if everything held together, he would discover exactly whose money he'd actually agreed to accept. Priya finalized the legal framework during the same period, preparing documents that would restructure voting rights and operational control the moment Cross Harbor Capital's acquisition closed, built specifically so that once Nathaniel's 60% combined with my existing 15, full operational authority over Amber and Vine would return to me for the first time in 3 years, regardless of whatever percentage Vanessa and Derek retained afterward. "There's one thing you should understand clearly before we move forward with the signing," Priya told me, the week before the scheduled closing. "Once this deal closes, Vanessa and Derek will still technically hold minority ownership, 25% between them, based on the current structure. You won't be legally rid of them entirely, not immediately, but you will hold majority control, operational authority, and the ability to eventually buy out their remaining stake entirely, on terms you control this time instead of terms buried in paperwork you never read closely enough." I asked her what that final buyout might realistically look like. "That depends considerably on how the closing meeting itself unfolds," she said, something careful in her tone that made me suspect she already anticipated exactly how badly that meeting was likely to go for the two people currently celebrating a windfall they didn't yet understand. The closing meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in a conference room at Priya's firm, chosen deliberately for its neutral ground rather than anywhere connected to the restaurant itself. Vanessa arrived first, dressed sharply, carrying herself with the particular confidence of someone who believes she's about to complete the most successful deal of her career. Derek arrived 10 minutes later, practically vibrating with excitement he made no real effort to disguise. I sat at the far end of the conference table, positioned there deliberately at Priya's suggestion, present as the minority shareholder whose signature was still technically required on certain transitional documents, though Vanessa clearly believed my presence was purely a formality. One final signature from the partner she was quietly eliminating from any meaningful role in the business she'd convinced herself she'd built essentially alone. "This is exciting," Vanessa said, glancing at me with an expression that almost passed for genuine warmth. "Cross Harbor's going to help us expand into a second location. I really think this benefits everyone, Stella, including you." I said nothing, watching the door. Nathaniel walked in exactly on time, dressed today in an actual suit rather than the casual sweater I'd first met him in, carrying himself with the composed authority of a man about to close a significant acquisition. I watched Vanessa's expression shift immediately upon seeing him, a flicker of recognition crossing her face that had nothing to do with ever having met him before, and everything to do with simply registering him as the buyer she'd been corresponding with through an intermediary for 6 weeks. "Mr. Cross," she said, standing to shake his hand, "we're thrilled to finally meet you in person." "Likewise," Nathaniel said, his voice perfectly professional, giving nothing away. "Shall we begin?" The documents were laid out exactly as Priya had structured them, and for the first 20 minutes, the meeting proceeded exactly as Vanessa and Derek expected. Standard acquisition language, transfer of 60% ownership to Cross Harbor Capital, revised operational structure moving forward. Derek signed his portion first, practically beaming, clearly imagining the payout heading toward his account within days. Vanessa reviewed her section more carefully, the particular caution of someone who had, after all, spent 3 years learning exactly how paperwork could hide its true implications from someone who trusted the person handing it to them. She paused on a clause outlining post-acquisition operational authority, her brow furrowing slightly. "This section here," she said, looking up at Priya rather than Nathaniel. "It says operational control transfers immediately upon closing, combined with existing minority shareholder voting rights." "What existing shareholder?" Priya's expression remained perfectly neutral. "Ms. Marchetti's existing 15% stake, combined with Cross Harbor's newly acquired 60%, establishes majority operational control effective immediately." I watched something shift behind Vanessa's eyes, quick calculation replacing confident warmth. Though she still hadn't fully connected the pieces, I could see her beginning to assemble. "That's a fairly unusual structure for an outside acquisition," she said carefully, looking back toward Nathaniel now. Most investors prefer independent control, not an arrangement that immediately hands authority to a minority partner who's currently facing operational disputes. Nathaniel met her eyes directly for the first time since walking in, and something in his expression finally gave her the answer she hadn't yet let herself consider. "I'm not most investors," he said, "and Stella isn't facing an operational dispute. She's recovering ownership of something that was quietly taken from her through paperwork she trusted the wrong people to prepare, honestly." The room went completely silent. Derek's pen, still hovering over his final signature line, froze halfway across the page. "What is he talking about?" Derek said, looking first at Vanessa, then at me, then back toward Nathaniel with the particular confusion of a man realizing, several steps too late, that the celebration he'd been anticipating for weeks had never actually been his to celebrate. "Cross Harbor Capital represents Stella's interest directly," Priya said, her voice calm, measured, carrying the specific satisfaction of an attorney who has waited weeks to say exactly this sentence. Mr. Cross approached this acquisition on her behalf, using an independent structure specifically so that neither of you would suspect her involvement until the deal had already closed. Vanessa stood up so quickly her chair scraped hard against the floor. "This is fraud. You can't structure an acquisition this way without disclosing the relationship between buyer and existing shareholder." "There's no relationship requiring disclosure," Priya said, sliding a folder across the table toward her. "Cross Harbor Capital is a legitimately independent entity, fully licensed, fully compliant with every disclosure requirement relevant to this transaction. Stella has no ownership stake in Cross Harbor whatsoever. She's simply the existing minority shareholder whose rights this acquisition legally strengthens, exactly as this document, which you've already partially signed, clearly states. I want to review this with my own counsel before finalizing anything further," Vanessa said, her voice tightening with the particular panic of someone realizing the ground has shifted entirely beneath her. "You're welcome to," Priya said, "though I'd note that Derek has already signed his portion of the agreement, and the terms are not severable between the two of you. Withdrawing now would require unwinding an already partially executed contract, which carries its own significant legal complications, particularly given the underlying circumstances of how you both came to hold your original ownership stakes in the first place." Derek's face had gone pale in a way I'd never seen on my brother before, the golden child suddenly understanding in real time that he'd signed away whatever leverage he thought he held, moments before discovering the entire foundation beneath that leverage had shifted without his knowledge. "You knew about this," he said, turning toward me directly for the first time since walking into the room. "You planned this. I learned 3 months ago that my best friend and my own brother had spent over a year quietly maneuvering to take a restaurant I built with my aunt's money and my own 2 hands," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, steadier than I'd felt at any point over the previous 3 months. "I didn't plan revenge, Derek. I planned to get back what was mine, using exactly the same kind of paperwork you both used to try taking it." Vanessa's composure finally cracked entirely, 3 years of careful patience collapsing into something raw and unguarded. "I built this business with you, Stella. I handled everything you didn't want to deal with, all the boring parts, all the parts that let you stay in your kitchen playing chef while I actually kept this company alive. You handled paperwork that quietly transferred 85% ownership to yourself while telling me it reflected an even split we'd always agreed to," I said. "You added my own brother as a shareholder without ever telling me why, and the two of you formed a separate company together 9 months ago, specifically to acquire the intellectual property I spent 3 years building. I'm not the one who needs to explain what actually happened here." Nathaniel remained quiet through most of this exchange, letting Priya and me carry the weight of a confrontation that belonged fundamentally to us rather than to him, though I noticed him watching me carefully throughout, something steady and unmistakably protective in his expression that I hadn't fully let myself register until that exact moment. The meeting ended without further signatures that day. Vanessa left first, practically running from the conference room, already dialing what I assumed was an attorney of her own, Derek lingered a moment longer, staring at the half-signed document in front of him, like it might somehow reverse itself if he stared hard enough. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said quietly, before finally standing to leave. "I just wanted something that was actually mine for once." "Nothing about this was ever going to be yours," I said. "Not honestly, anyway. You wanted something you didn't build, the same way you've wanted that your entire life." He left without responding, and I sat in that conference room afterward with Priya and Nathaniel, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been tight for 3 solid months. Though I understood the fight wasn't entirely finished yet, it took another 6 weeks of legal maneuvering before the situation fully resolved. Weeks that tested every ounce of patience I had left. Vanessa's attorney attempted several different arguments, claiming the acquisition structure violated disclosure obligations, claiming undue influence, claiming Priya had engineered an ethical conflict by representing my interests while allowing Cross Harbor to negotiate independently. Every argument collapsed under scrutiny, largely because Priya had anticipated each one months earlier and built the transaction specifically to withstand exactly this kind of challenge. Faced with a legal battle they were unlikely to win, and facing the additional complication of the original fraudulent ownership documents I'd already begun challenging separately through Priya's earlier discovery work, both Vanessa and Derek eventually agreed to a settlement considerably less favorable than what they'd originally believed they were walking away with. Vanessa retained a small minority stake, 12%, far less than the 85% she'd once quietly claimed for herself, with no operational authority whatsoever. Derek's 5% was reduced to 2%, structured as a passive investment with no voting rights, no involvement in daily operations, essentially a small financial acknowledgement of an ownership claim that never should have existed in the first place. I bought out both remaining stakes entirely within 4 months of the settlement. Using profits the restaurant continued generating even through the entire dispute, finally becoming, for the first time in 3 years, the sole and complete owner of Amber and Vine exactly the way I had always believed myself to be from the very beginning. Vanessa and I have not spoken since that conference room. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she eventually took a marketing position at a hotel chain in Denver, far enough from Portland that our paths seem unlikely to cross again. Though I no longer feel the particular grief I once assumed I'd carry over losing a friendship I'd trusted since I was 20 years old, some losses I've come to understand are simply the price of learning who someone actually is beneath years of careful performance. Derek reached out once, several months after the settlement finalized, an awkward phone call in which he apologized in the vague, circular way he'd always apologized for everything throughout our childhood, more focused on explaining his own financial desperation than genuinely reckoning with what he'd tried to take from me. I told him I appreciated the call and that I needed considerably more time before I could imagine trusting him with anything meaningful again. We speak occasionally now, carefully, the way you speak to family you love but no longer fully trust. And I've made peace with the idea that this particular relationship may never fully recover the closeness we once had as children. Nathaniel and I began seeing each other roughly 2 months after the settlement closed, slowly at first, both of us cautious about the specific dynamics of a relationship that had begun, in its own strange way, through a business betrayal neither of us had chosen. Our first actual dinner together, not connected to legal strategy or acquisition documents, happened at a small Italian place 3 blocks from Amber and Vine, both of us laughing at how strange it felt to sit across from each other without a folder of contracts between us. "I have to ask something," I told him that night, turning my wine glass slowly between my fingers. "Why did you actually take this case? The real reason, not the version you gave me in that first meeting." He was quiet for a moment, something unguarded crossing his expression that I hadn't seen from him during any of our earlier, more strategic conversations. My mother built a small accounting firm from nothing, back when I was a teenager. Her business partner eventually did something very similar to what Vanessa did to you, slowly shifting ownership through paperwork my mother trusted without reading closely enough. She lost almost everything before she finally found the right lawyer to help her fight back. And by the time she won, The fight had cost her most of what she'd actually built. I've spent most of my career since then trying to make sure that particular kind of quiet theft doesn't succeed against people who remind me of her. I understood, hearing that, exactly why his patience and his precision throughout the entire process had felt different from simple professional obligation, something closer to genuine conviction underneath the careful legal strategy. We married quietly the following autumn, a small ceremony held at Amber and Vine itself after closing hours. The restaurant decorated simply with candles and the same amber-colored light that had inspired its name years earlier, streaming through the west windows exactly as the sun began to set. My mother attended, along with a handful of close friends, and Priya stood as one of my witnesses, having become, over the course of that difficult year, something considerably closer to a friend than simply an attorney handling my case. Derek came to the wedding too, standing quietly near the back, and though our relationship remains far from what it once was, I found myself glad he was there. Evidence of a slow, imperfect healing neither of us has fully finished yet. Amber and Vine continues thriving now, a second location finally opening last spring in a neighboring city, built this time on ownership documents I read personally, line by line, before signing anything at all. I still work the kitchen most evenings, though I've finally learned to trust a small team of managers with the parts of the business I once believed I had to control entirely myself in order to protect what I'd built. I think often about that stack of formation documents I signed 3 years ago, standing in a chaotic kitchen while a health inspector waited and a walk-in freezer leaked water across the floor, trusting a friendship enough to sign my future away without reading it closely. I don't regret the trust itself, not entirely. I regret only that I once believed love and loyalty meant never questioning the people closest to me, when real love, the kind Nathaniel has shown me every day since that conference room, has never once asked me to stop paying attention. Some mornings now, standing in my restaurant before the first customers arrive, watching amber light spread slowly across empty tables exactly the way it did the day we first opened, I think about the woman I was 3 years ago, certain that building something with your own hands was enough to guarantee it would always remain yours. She wasn't wrong to build it. She was only wrong about who deserved to stand beside her while she did. I own every table, every recipe, every square foot of this restaurant now, completely, honestly, without a single signature I haven't read carefully first, and without a single person left in my life who mistakes my trust for something they're entitled to quietly take.
Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.